Hi everybody. Today we're going to be talking about relative pronouns, part of our reviewing the basics of English grammar. So relative pronouns, very important. Some rules to follow, but not that difficult. We use relative pronouns to connect a phrase or clause to a noun. The phrase or clause modifies, defines, or describes the noun or pronoun. For example, the tortelli that is filled with erbette is made by hand. Now, relative pronouns can be used in restrictive or non-restrictive clauses. Let's take a look at some examples so we can understand what those terms mean. The woman who works in my office is from Croatia. Now, look at the difference with this sentence. The woman who works in my office is from Croatia. The first sentence is what we consider to be a restrictive clause. The second is what we consider a non-restrictive clause. So the second is something that can be removed from the sentence without altering the meaning. It is additional information. So we can consider a non-restrictive clause as parenthetical, and we surround it with commas. For example, the woman who lives upstairs from me is called Angela. This is an example of a non-restrictive clause. The section of the sentence, who lives upstairs from me, is additional information, and it could simply be removed and still make sense. Now, as we look at the different relative pronouns, they are who, whom, that, which, where, when, and whose. We only use who for people. We only use whom for people. We use that for people, animals, or things. We use which for animals or things, or to refer to a prior complete sentence. We use where to refer to places. We use when to refer to times, and we use whose to refer to possession. One thing to be careful of, it's easy to confuse who and whom, that and which, whose and whose. Notice that the pronunciation of those last two are the same, but the meaning is different. Both who and whom only refer to people, but who refers to subjects, and whom refers to objects, usually objects of a preposition. Remember, we can think of the difference between objects and subjects. The subjects are the actors in a sentence, and the object receives the action. Let's look at some examples. Sylvia is the person to whom I wrote the letter. Bob is the person for whom I wrote the letter. My sister is the person with whom I wrote the letter. In each of these cases, I is the subject, and in the first, Sylvia is the person who received the letter. Bob instructed me, but I wrote the letter, and my sister helped me, but I wrote the letter. So we have the preposition to whom, for whom or with whom. Looking a little more at who. The dentist who pulled out my tooth should be in prison now. This is a restrictive use of who. The man who I called by mistake was grumpy and old. This is non-restrictive. So I could remove that center section between the commas. The man was grumpy and old. Complete sentence. The man, now giving additional information, who I called by mistake, was grumpy and old. Looking at whose, we use whose to show possession. The man whose jacket I am wearing is my friend Tom. Whose, like we said before, is not the same as the contraction whose. Who's that? Who is that? Contracted to whose. Okay, let's look carefully at that and which. It's important to note that is only used in restrictive clauses, which is often used in both restrictive and non-restrictive clauses, especially in British English. Americans tend to more exclusively use which in a non-restrictive clause. Let's look at a couple of examples. The thesis that I wrote was well received. The thesis idea, which I had to change 3 times, was well received. All right, now let's look at one use of which. This is using which to refer to a prior complete sentence. So here's an example. Some people post horrible comments on social media, which may create a toxic environment. So here in this case, some people post horrible comments on social media is a complete sentence. And then I'm giving additional information using which. Okay, so let's look at some examples. See if you can figure these out. The company is expanding in India, announced plans to invest $1.7 billion in the country. What's going to go in that space? Which. The company, which is expanding in India, announced plans to invest $1.7 billion in the country. Okay, next sentence. There is a change within the company is related to mindset, culture, and behavior. What's going to go in that gap? So, one correct option, there is a change within the company that is related to mindset, culture, and behavior. It's also correct to say there is a change within the company which is related to mindset, culture, and behavior. The first, more typical of American English. The second, very typical of British English. So, both are correct, but for most people it will be easier to follow the rules by using that in this case. Okay, another sentence. The company is being bought by larger rival Aetna Inc. in a $3.7 billion deal, may also be helped by a weak flu season. What's going to go in here? Okay, in this case, we're only going to use which because this can be taken out, that whole section, which is being bought by larger rival Aetna Inc. in a $3.7 billion deal, That can just be removed from the sentence. Next example. The police have arrested the owner of the factory. The fire broke out and initiated an investigation. What's going to go in here? We're talking about a place, so where? The police have arrested the owner of the factory where the fire broke out and initiated an investigation. Okay, next example. South Africa's 2020 maize crop is to double last year's harvest at 15.77 million tons, up 51% from the 7.78 million tons last year. An El Niño-triggered drought hit yields and plantings. What are we talking about in this case? We're talking about time. So we're going to use when. South Africa's 2020 maize crop is to double last year's harvest at 15.77 million tons, up 51% from the 7.78 million tons last year, when an El Niño-triggered drought hit yields and plantings. Next example, Guardiola, mother died in the COVID-19 pandemic, has donated 1 million euros to the fight against coronavirus in Spain. What are we going to use here? Whose? Guardiola, whose mother died in the COVID-19 pandemic, has donated 1 million euros to the fight against coronavirus in Spain. Next example. Officials expect more cases to be filed against the owner. Investigators are requesting additional information from. What are we going to use in this case? In this case, whom? Officials expect more cases to be filed against the owner, whom investigators are requesting additional information from. That actually is from whom. Remember, to whom, with whom, for whom, from whom. So this is the object form. And a final example. AstraZeneca is in the midst of a phase 3 clinical trial, may be completed by the end of November. What are you going to use here? Here you're going to use which, because the which is referring to what comes before, which would be a complete sentence on its own. AstraZeneca is in the midst of a phase 3 clinical trial. Period. Full stop. That would be a complete sentence, and now you're going to refer back to it and give additional information, which may be completed by the end of November. All right, I hope all of this has given you a lot more to think about in the use of relative pronouns. When you want to find out more or you have any questions, best place to look is on our board at pinterest.com/unblockyourenglish. All right, hope this was helpful.